Welcome to Astrology Hub TV, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Pua Walsh, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Astrology Hub. And Astrology Hub TV is a weekly show dedicated to helping you cultivate your connection to the cosmos and how cultivating this connection can help you live a more empowered, fulfilling, and vibrant life. We're here every Thursday at 7 o'clock Eastern, 4 o'clock Pacific. And if you have not yet signed up for live alerts, please sign up. The link is in the chat and also above the description, above the video, and you will get an alert via Facebook Messenger every time that we go live, so you will not miss an episode. And this week, I am so excited to be featuring Hermetic Astrologer Gary Caton in his Astrology Hub debut. So we're going to be talking about Mercury today. In 2018, Mercury is spending more time in the 3 fire signs than all other 9 signs combined. So let's get prepared for Mercury's elemental year ahead with Gary. And on today's episode, you're going to learn about the Mercurial Vintage and how to align with the elemental emphasis of Mercury's transits this year, the tremendous transformation associated with Mercury Retrograde and its placement in your chart. And you're going to learn ways of fortifying your communications and expanding your horizons in 2018. Gary, it is so wonderful to have you here with us today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Aloha, Amanda. Thank you for having me.
All right. So Gary and I were speaking before the show, and we were wondering what we would like to know about you today, all of you out there, in regard to Mercury. And Gary thought of the question, how was your last Mercury retrograde experience? We'd love to hear from you in the chat. How was your experience? Was it annoying and frustrating? Was it good? Was it just you didn't even notice that it happened? Just let us know, and I'm going to look at those later. But just so you know, Gary is going to help us today really start to create a new type of relationship with Mercury and with Mercury retrograde. So this episode is for you if you've ever said, damn you, Mercury retrograde, if you've ever just been so frustrated. This episode is for you if you think there is not a religious tradition that accompanies Western astrology. So we're going to be talking about that. And this episode's for you if you want to say yes to Mercury retrograde. You want to learn how to celebrate and ride the Mercury retrograde wave. All right, I'm going to introduce Gary a little bit more formally. Gary P. Caton is a transdisciplinary astrologer who embraces an organic, process-oriented approach to spiritual transformation via engagement with the living sky. Initiated an astrologer by a magnificent dream in 1993, Gary has since devoted his entire life to refining this vision. An accomplished stargazer and astrophotographer, Gary combines the experiential power and dynamic images of the living sky with classic horoscopy and metaphysics, and delivers this alchemical blend through the matrix of bleeding-edge modern research and pioneering technique in his new book, Hermetic Triptych, The Mercury Elemental Year. You can also catch Gary online via the popular Hermetic Astrology podcast or live on one of his frequent lecture tours across the U.S. and abroad. Okay, so Gary, can we start? It's awesome. It's awesome. It's great stuff. But what I would love to do is start with, what is Hermetic astrology? What does that even mean for those who don't know what it is?
Right. Hermetic astrology is a tradition within the not only astrology community, but also magic and alchemy are related sister arts in the Hermetic tradition. If we go back to the foundations of what Hermeticism is, actually Hermes was thought to be an antediluvian prophet on par with Moses or Jesus. So that Hermes was essentially the Jesus figure of a Gnostic mystery religion. And Hermes was the founder of astrology and magic and writing and these things. So Hermeticism really is the religious tradition upon which Western tropical astrology was founded.
And how did you weave your way to it?
That took a little while. I mean, I was really fortunate very early in my career. I was out hitchhiking, a very mercurial activity. And I wound up in Berkeley Springs, West Virginia in the mid-90s, which just so happened to be the time when Project Hindsight was going down there. So I got my feet wet in the classical tradition. Project Hindsight, for those who don't know, is a translation project where a lot of these old documents in Latin and Greek and all these other languages were being translated for the first time in history. So there was a lot of traditional wisdom being unearthed that time, and I just happened to, by pure luck, be hitchhiking through the town where it was going down. So that was my first experience. But yeah, as I started to look into alchemy, I met a guy in Asheville where I was living for quite a while who was into alchemy. And I started realizing that alchemy and magic were not these other things that were like sideline pursuits, but they were actually all part of a three-part tradition that where alchemy and magic and astrology were all practiced together as sister arts of Hermeticism.
Okay, can you define alchemy?
Right. So what is Hermeticism? Now, what is alchemy? Yeah, alchemy, like a lot of people think, right, that it's about turning lead into gold, right? And it is that to a degree. There's a laboratory function in alchemy, and it's not just about working and understanding the metals. There are 7 basic metals that correspond to the 7 planets. Lead being Saturn and gold being the sun and the other ones in between. But there's also plant alchemy, like Nicholas Culpeper is a famous, you might have a copy of Culpeper's Herbal somewhere if you're into working with herbs. There's herbal alchemy, which is essentially the making of tinctures, healing tinctures and stuff. And there's also psycho-spiritual alchemy, which is about, it was early depth psychology is what it was. Alchemy was the earliest prototype of depth psychology. And so it was a way to achieve psycho-spiritual transformation. As you were going through the laboratory work, there was an inner transformation, as without, so within, you see? So that's the basic idea, yeah.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about the Mercurial Vintage and how to align with the elemental emphasis of Mercury's transits this year.
Right, so every once in a while you might see on your Facebook feed, somebody says, oh my God, Mercury retrograde and my car broke down, or oh my God, Mercury retrograde and my, computer hard drive crashed, or, well, various permutations of that. And people go, oh, Mercury, what's Mercury? When's it coming? How do I look out for it? And so on and so forth. Well, it's actually quite predictable. It doesn't sneak up on you if you know astrology. It's really beautiful, in fact, because every year the Mercury retrogrades happen in the sign of one astrological element, right? So there's 4 elements: fire, water, air, earth, and each year one of those elements you will find the Mercury retrograde. So right away, that's pretty predictable. It's only 1 out of 4. And we know right where it's going to be, so it's kind of like easy. It's easy to watch for it, And what's really interesting, because of the retrograde, as you said earlier, you get this planet that's known for being speedy, spending more time in one place, in one element, than all the other 9 signs combined. And it's like, wow, so there's a really profound emphasis going on there. And what I have found is that when you have these emphases, right, for instance, people who are familiar with outer planet astrology, I was born in the 60s when Uranus and Pluto were in Virgo, for instance. And that's a big generational influence that lasts a long time, and a lot of people have that placement. And so, a lot of people say, well, if something's in one place for a long time, you should pay attention to it. By that same token, we know that Mercury is going to be in these fire signs more than any other place this year. Seems like our messages could take on a fiery quality, you know, and that by taking on a fiery quality, we would be tuning into a collective vibration that would be more successful in terms of our branding, in terms of our, you know, in terms of our promotions and so forth. By making ourselves fiery, we're automatically tuning into the dominant Mercury theme of the year.
What was 2017?
Earth.
Okay. So every Mercury retrograde that happens this year is going to be in fire. And so what you're saying is that if we align our communications, our like you were saying, promotions, marketing, whatever it is, even in interpersonal, would you say interpersonal as well, in
Sure.
more of a fiery tone? What would that look like to you?
Well, fire, this is really wonderful because we can talk about fire in several ways, but most people understand fire as very hot. Yeah, it's active. It's not passive. Yeah, so and it's also like the most dynamic of all the elements. So being dynamic in your messages, being assertive in your messages, really going after what you want and asking for what you want, it has much more, you know, chance of succeeding this year than by, you know, kind of, you know, coming at things sideways, or, you know, being a little more of a team player or whatever, which might be more the case with Earth, right? Because Earth is a downward tending element, right? We have to dig down in the earth to find all the cool stuff. Fire, you don't have to dig for it. It just, poof, it's just up there, right? So just being out there and being who you are, and being easy to see and easy to read. These are all ways that we can align with the spirit of fire.
Seems like anyone that feels like they might have an inspirational message too, or something that they want to do to inspire.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
That as well.
Yeah, fire is definitely known for being inspirational. Fire is the least dense of the four elements, right? Because it's really, I mean, every child knows that if you throw a rock into a stream, it will sink. So earth is the most dense of the four elements, and then water. And then if you heat water, of course, it rises into vapor into the air, and fire goes up even through the thin air. So it's the least dense of, so it's definitely associated with spirituality and inspiration, and also the more subtle levels of something. So one of the things in alchemy, you hear them talk about separate the subtle from the gross. You know, separate the sort of earthy, you know, tangible parts of something, the clunky parts of something, from the subtle, the more, you know, refined, the more idealistic part of something. Actually focusing on that part would be more of a fiery message than the nuts and bolts kind of stuff that might be more, you know, that might go more with earth.
Okay, very nice. All right, so let's talk about the tremendous transformation associated with Mercury retrograde first, like before we talk about the placement in your chart. So
right.
What opportunity do you have through Mercury retrograde?
Right, so I've actually done an extremely exhaustive study of what the heck is retrograde motion. And because it's not simply this back and forth, right? You see these diagrams where it goes you and then back. I call it a squished S. It looks like, you've seen those, yeah? Where it kind of does this. That's not at all what it does. If you actually watch these things and plot them in the sky, it does this, or it does this, or it does that. It does these loops. So it varies as much in the up and down as it does in the back and forth. And even more interestingly, during the retrograde, Mercury penetrates the heart space of our local system. So the space between the sun and the earth, that's that sun-earth enclave, if you will, the heart center of our solar system. That's called the astronomical unit, that distance, right? Mercury is one of only 3 planets that penetrates that Sun-Earth space. Mars and Venus are also capable of doing this, and they all do it during the retrograde. So there's this mixing of above and below, like conscious, unconscious. There's this mixing of direct and retrograde, like status quo versus, something new. And there's this mixing between inner and outer, microcosm, macrocosm, like collective versus personal. There's this tremendous mixing that's going on. And if you know anything about the ocean, for instance, you live in Hawaii, I'm sure you're aware of this. All the life in the oceans is where the currents mix together. You get a cold current that comes along and it hits a warm current. There's so much life that just blossoms out of that mixing, right?
It's true at the edge of the forest too.
At the edge of the forest, yeah, you get that mixing between habitats, and that's where all the life is. In fact, astrology came out of a cultural mixing between Mesopotamia and Egypt and Greece. Yeah, there was, after Alexander the Great conquered the known world at the time, he said, hey, you don't necessarily need to become Greeks in culture, just pay tribute. And in fact, send your scholars to Alexandria and tell us about your culture. We want to record it. So this tremendous mixing of culture exploded into what we know as Western tropical astrology. So this mixing that Mercury does is tremendously creative. And yes, it can be disruptive. But if you only focus on the disruptive part, you're missing all the beautiful creative part,
So tell me more about that heart space. So what do you mean by Mercury going, what does that mean for us?
Right, so Mercury is literally closest to the Earth during the retrograde, right? Mercury is what we call, the Germans call it Wechsel, meaning alternating. Jupiter and Saturn, for instance, and Mars, most of the time, are always farther away from the Earth than the distance between the Sun and the Earth. They're always like pretty far away. Venus and Mercury can be farther away than the Sun, but they can also be closer than the Sun. They can also be in between the Sun and the Earth. So that if you think about the Sun, I mean, the Sun is a star. The Sun is one of the creative engines of the universe. All of the carbon in our bodies was created from some star exploding, and in the last seconds of its life, it fuses the carbon and the heavy elements and then spews it out across the universe, right? That enormous creative potential that is the Sun is like, it's mind-boggling, really, to take in on an everyday level, right? So we have this idea in astrology that the moon absorbs that light and holds it during the waxing cycle, right? Then she becomes full, completely illuminated, and then she releases that light over. So we need the moon to help us to be able to kind of step down or transform that solar light into something usable here on the Earth plane. By the same token, as the moon travels and is an intermediary for that solar force, Mercury can do the same thing. Mercury during the retrograde is lined up between the Sun and the Earth. So there's this penetration of the heart space of our system, and there's this ability for Mercury to serve as kind of the intermediary between you and this tremendous creative force. In some of the traditional astrology texts, they'll use the metaphor that the exact conjunction between the Sun and a planet they call it Kazemi, which means in the heart of the Sun. And the metaphor they use is that the planet is in the throne room of the king or queen. It's like this, and right, if you go see the king or queen, like anything's possible. You could get your head cut off if you screw up. You could get granted a huge estate and be rich for the rest of your life. Anything can happen in the presence of the king or queen. it's the same thing with the sun. Yeah, there's this huge, tremendous potential that we can tap into while Mercury's in this creative space.
Okay, now tell us about the placement in the chart. What's the transformational opportunity there?
Right. So you know what I found, I've been all over the country for the last 10 years or so, giving talks to people and everything, and I'll tell them about a certain thing and they go, somebody will raise their hand, what does it mean in my chart? And it's like, yeah, okay. That's so how you apply this to your chart is that if we know this year, for instance, that all the Mercury retrogrades are happening in fire, then anyone who's born this year will have those houses that are associated with the fire signs, right? Houses are a personal division of the sky based on your unique birth time, right? Your ascendant or horoscopos. Those three houses will be the source of all this mixing, right? So even if you weren't born during an exact Mercury retrograde, everybody knows that when you get, you know, you're going down the river or in the ocean in a canoe, for instance, and you turn the boat, right? There's this wake that happens, and that wake travels on down the river. It's the same way. There's these wakes are going to be present in those three houses. So that if we look to the Mercury retrograde element of our birth, then we can see where the elemental vintage of that year, of our birth year, was, and what particular areas we can expect that rich tumult to be happening in.
Okay, so let's talk. We talked a little bit about fire, and we talked a tiny little bit about earth, but maybe you can talk to us about each of them so that if people do want to go look at you're saying the Mercury vintage, that's what we say about which
I call it the Mercury vintage because, you know, wines bottled in a particular year are supposed to have a certain quality, right? And so yeah, you know, Mercury is in a particular element for a year, so that's the vintage. Yeah.
Okay, so depending on people's Mercury vintage, can we just kind of go through the four and talk about the flavor and what that might mean for them?
Yeah, sure. And I can even read to you a little from my book at some point.
Yes.
But just off the cuff, one thing that I noticed is, for instance, with water years, water is tremendously sensitive and able to transmit information in a way that other elements are not. You know, vibration travels through water. One of the things that I learned really early in my life as a young boy, my father would take me fishing. And, you know, as a kid, I'm running down to the shore. I want to get down there and catch a fish, right? And he's like, easy, easy, kiddo. You know, he's like, the fish can feel you running along the shore. You know, you got to sneak up on them. It's like, think of it like this. We're hunting fish. And I was like, okay. Because I knew what hunting was like. You can't just run up to a deer, right? But you don't necessarily think about that with water. So there's this tremendous vibrational sensitivity that comes with water. You might be familiar with, back in the 90s, there was a great New Age book that came out called the Celestine Prophecy.
Yeah.
That book came out in a water year. And then you probably heard of The Secret, right? That book came out during the next water year. These, by the way, it takes about 6 or 7 years for any one of these elements to repeat. So now the good news is, after we have this...
Let me ask a very basic question. How's that possible if there's only 4?
Yeah, so it's a little bit more than a year.
Okay.
I say Mercury elemental year, but, you know, it's like a year and a quarter, year and a half.
All right.
But, you know, it's not 2 years, so year. But anyway, so we had the Celestine Prophecy, then The Secret. Now the good news is that right after we have this fire year, the next water year is coming. So like maybe the next big New Age, you know, you know, thing is coming. The bad news is you've only got a year to do it. So if you aren't already doing it, it's probably not you. But
Oh, yeah. You never know.
but you know, that's the thing, is like you can begin to see these patterns and you can begin to plan for it, right? That's the idea behind this concept, is that it's a predictable pattern. We know it's coming. And so, you know, these, with the water years, I think there's a tremendous kind of psychic or occult sensing that comes with that. Bob Dylan was born in a water year, tremendously talented person, because so universal. I mean, think of how many different Bob Dylans there are. You know, it depends on, I don't know if you even know who I'm talking about. Okay, you're hip to Bob Dylan. Yeah, some of the people, I said something about Bob Dylan to a younger person and they're like, who's that? I was like, are you kidding me? But yeah, you know, water doesn't have a shape of its own. It takes on the shape of whatever container it encounters. So there's this wonderful malleability also that comes along with it. They can change into any shape that they want. And at the same time, they kind of need a container to have any shape. You know, so there's this interesting dynamic then between earth and water, because earth provides the boundary that water needs, and water provides the nourishing sort of fluid that keeps earth from drying out and becoming sterile, you know?
Yeah. Okay, so Gary, we have a vintage year, and we'll go through all of them, but we have a vintage year, and then these cycle every 6 years-ish. When we're in an elemental year that matches our birth vintage, how does that interact versus when we're in one that doesn't?
Right. So the elements interact in different ways that can be kind of harmonious. Like I said, earth and water, they kind of need each other. Yeah, and fire and air kind of need each other. Fire needs air to keep burning, and air needs fire to move, to be able to move. So there's harmonious kind of relationships between the elements, and then like water and fire, it's a little more polarized. You know, water can put out fire, fire can, you know, boil water, and so forth. So there's different relationships. But to answer your first question, when the Mercury elemental year of any given year, of like say 2018, if you were also born in a fire year, or whenever the Mercury elemental year currently matches your birth year, I call those Mercury elemental year returns. And there's 12 of them in the course of a lifetime. There's 12 of them over 79 years. And this, what happens is your basic vintage, your basic unconscious preference for communicating, for symbol making, is matched by the collective. Everybody's kind of talking on your channel. And so that's a wonderful opportunity to really get your message out there and be seen authentically for what you really are, right? Because in psychology, you know, we talk about being seen. For someone to really see you for who you actually are, that's a very powerful thing, and it's not as common as we would like to think it is. You know what I'm saying? And it's so, and when somebody says, you're not hearing me, you know, it's like, you know, you're listening to the words, but you're not hearing the message, you know. So we have a lot better chance of being seen and heard for who we really authentically are during those years. And so those can usually result in significant success and breakthroughs and so forth. I have all kinds of examples but if you just do the math, you know, 6.5, 7. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence at age 33 during a Mercury elemental year return. That's the first one that's coming to my mind. But, you know, I have examples in my book from all of these different returns, and each return essentially represents another level of perfection of our birth vintage. So like when you first brew wine, it's still kind of cloudy and still got some of the yeast in there and stuff. And then after a while it settles, right? And then you filter it, and it gets, with age, it gets more and more refined, right? You separate the subtle from the gross. So each one of these returns results in a further perfection of your birth vintage. And I have a whole chapter in the book dedicated to that idea, that it's a developmental pattern that we can track through a lifetime. It's really beautiful.
Okay. All right. Someone wants to know your sign.
My sun sign?
Yeah.
Yeah, Aries.
Aries. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. So we've done a little water. We've done some fire. We've done a little tiny bit of earth. I don't know if you want to do earth and air a little bit more.
Okay. Yeah, sure. I was born in an air year, actually. So since somebody was just asking my sign, my Mercury Vintage is air, and which is really funny because the only other thing I have in my chart is Aquarius rising. That's in air. I don't have any planets in air, and yet I've always been, kind of a smart, intellectually, active person. And I've always thought, like, how is that possible? I don't have any air in my chart. Well, that's my vintage, But the funny thing is that when I got to college, I found I didn't really belong. Like I'm kind of an autodidact, self-taught. I like exploring all kinds of learning, but I don't like being confined by a curriculum. So that because we're talking about a retrograde, because we're talking about these mixing, because we're talking about somewhat contrary principles, I found that, my experience of the air element, which often for a lot of people would have to do with learning and communication and so forth, was kind of countercultural. It was, I'm not at home in academia, even though I'm perfectly capable. I mean, if somebody, gave me a chunk of money, I could have 3 PhDs by now. But I'm just not really interested in that. I'm interested in astrology and all the stuff you can't do in academia. So you see, there's this kind of counter cultural emphasis that goes along with your vintage, where it's like you're here to help redefine what the culture, how the culture expresses that element, and so by personally expressing it differently, you can help reinform the culture because that's how things stay alive and keep growing, is through having different currents, coming in and out. So air and earth, the thing I love about earth, I live in Alexandria, Virginia right now. Right up the road is, DC, with all the Smithsonian museums and stuff. And the Museum of Natural History has like this whole wing, and all it is like crystals and all the rocks and stuff. I'm kind of a rock hound because I'm a Virgo moon, which is an earth sign. But look at the tremendous variety that you find. I mean, people think earth, oh, it's dirt, like how boring. Nothing could be further from the truth. You start digging down a little bit and you find all these incredible minerals and all. So, earth people are generally very multifaceted, very multi-talented, have a tremendous variety of interests and abilities. And earth years, therefore, are often about discovering new interests and new mixtures of interests and new people who turn you on to new facets of yourself and stuff like that.
Okay, great. All right, so we do have some questions coming in, Gary.
Awesome.
The name of your book, Hermetica Triptycha.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you spell that triptycha? It's Triptycha.
Hermetica Triptycha.
Nice, thank you. Okay. All right, so let's go back to Mercury Retrograde. And we had a comment come in that I wanted to read. So Marilyn says, so is he saying that instead of fearing the retrograde period, use it to our advantage? For instance, this year in fire, communicate without fear, spread yourself like fire.
Absolutely. That's beautiful. I love it. One of the things that fire does is it spreads out. It moves up and out. So far-reaching messages. I mean, think about the one that we just went through, the archer. I mean, there's nothing more far-reaching than a flaming arrow. Just, you know, shoot for the farthest horizon you can. I mean, that's absolutely with fire. That's right in there with the spirit of fire, you know. You know, so fire is very active. Now, fire is also separative in that it separates one thing from another, right? Fire will, when it burns through a place, you know, you have this beautiful green part where it didn't burn, and then you have this place that's been kind of renewed. So separating yourself from the crowd, right? And showing your uniqueness, and showing what you do that no one else does, or what you have to say that no one else is saying. This is also very much a part of the fire mythos too.
Awesome. That sounds really exciting. And so
2020
will be water, right?
That's right. The pattern is fire, water, air, earth. And that's actually the reverse order of the zodiac, right? Because in the zodiac, we have Aries, fire, Taurus, earth, Gemini, air, Cancer, water, right? But of course, Mercury retrograde goes through the elements in reverse. And it's really fascinating because there's this mystical document called the Emerald Tablet that is supposed to contain the formula for the Philosopher's Stone. It's an alchemical document, and it talks about the elements. It says its father is the sun, its mother the moon, the wind carries it in its belly, its nurse is the earth. So you notice the order there: sun, fire; moon, water; wind, air; and earth, earth. Yeah. So there's a couple different correspondences between what Mercury actually does as a planet with this mystical document. And so that's something that I thought was really incredible. I wrote a blog for the Mountain Astrologer website earlier this year also, where I talked about this order in terms of the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus. And he thought that the elements transformed into one another in this order as well, in the beginning of the universe. So there's this very primal, you know, in all the native cultures, tricksters were very creative. Oftentimes, you know, Coyote, for instance, in Native American, was one of the creators. So this backwardness is associated with primordial creativity. And so, yeah, so fire, water, air, earth, that's the order. And once you know the order, you can kind of begin to dance with it, and you can plan out your, you know, messages for the next 7 years and kind of figure out, you know, okay, you know, and see how you want to flow, you know, your marketing campaigns and so forth.
Gary, how did you do this research?
Yeah, so I do a lot of astrophotography, and I go out and actually take photographs of Mercury and the other planets. And so I was watching Mercury and how it would be visible, and then it would be not visible, above, below. There's a lot of talk about above and below in this alchemical literature. And in fact, most people think that this document that I just held up, the Emerald Tablet, that it says as above, so below. It don't say that. What it says, and I'll read to you, it says, that which is above, that which is below corresponds to that which is above, and that which is above corresponds to that which is below, to accomplish the miracles of the one. So you see, there's not this above kind of forcing something to happen on the below. There's not this causation in the heavens that's, causing things to happen in our lives. The below corresponds to the above, and the above corresponds to the below. They're in correspondence. There's an exchange of communication, a co-creative exchange, you see. And what I found is that if you follow the astronomy of Mercury, that's actually what the planet is doing. Mercury makes what's called a maximum elongation above the horizon. That's at his most visible appearance. Then he makes the conjunction with the sun. Remember, I talked about the cazimi and the heart of the sun. And then he makes another visible elongation in the other sky. So it starts out in the west, above, below, and then above in the east. And all three of these events happen in the same degrees. So I had this emerald tablet document on my desk, and I was thinking of it as like this esoteric thing. And as I was going out and watching the sky, I think it's actually doing what this thing, like it's literal. And so I ended up making 125 years of ephemerides to track this, so that I could begin using it in my practice. And then once I started actually using it in my practice, I was like, OMG, this is incredible. I got to write more about it. And next thing you know, I've got a book.
Nice. Okay.
Yeah.
Are you hearing echo on my speakers?
I'm not hearing any echo. I can maybe bring my volume down a little bit if that'll help.
Okay. Awesome. Shirley asked, I got a little lost about the significance of the sign Mercury is in my birth chart and which element Mercury retrograde was in during that time. Which one do I look at to see if I am the same or something different than Mercury retrograde this year? So I think she's asking about the interplay between.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, each one of us was born at a particular moment, and most of us aren't born during Mercury retrograde, right? But all of us were born in a year when Mercury was spending more time in one sign or one triplicity, one element, than all the other elements combined. Okay, so even if you weren't born at a time when Mercury was retrograde, or even if you were born at a time when Mercury was in a water sign, if you were born in a year that Mercury was in the fire, spending most time in the fire signs, that element is going to serve as a container. It's going to inform your birth. And this is not something that I just pulled out of my hat. I mean, astrologers have been using prenatal, alignments. They'll look at the lunation that occurred before your birth, for instance. So that, in other words, we're looking at a container or a contextual vessel for, it's like the glyph for the sun. You have that little dot in the middle, and then you have the big circle, right? So you're that little dot. You're that singular, individualized expression of something eternal. And the more collective expression of Mercury is the elemental year that will then inform your personal Mercury at a deeper, broader level. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, I think so. I'm the one with the echo, but it appears to be gone. Good. Okay. All right. I think that answers. Shirley, will you confirm if that answered your question? And so, Gary, to find our elemental year, we have to look in your book? Are there other places where we can find our Mercury?
Sure. Anyone who knows how to read what's called an ephemeris, it's easy enough to find out where the Mercury retrogrades were happening. You can go to ephemeris.com for that matter. But yeah, I created the ephemerides first for my use with my clients, and then once I had the ephemerides, I thought, well, why not put them in the book, because then it's all in one package. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, they are in the book, and you can definitely get them there. But basically, any place you look up planetary positions, you can find this.
Annie says, all those years I freaked about having Mercury retrograde. Not so bad after all.
Yay!
Yay! We're recording. Good. Good.
It's hugely creative. Hugely creative.
Great. Okay. Let's see what else. Let's go to just, I know we've been talking about 2018 quite a bit. Do you want to say anything else about ways of fortifying our communications and expanding our horizons in 2018?
Right. So there's different houses that can be activated depending on your ascendant. Yeah. So if you have a fire sign on your ascendant, then the houses that are going to be activated are the first house, the fifth house, and the ninth house. And I call these the identity trigon because the angular house of those three is the first house. It's your identity. So if you have a fire sign ascendant, this is going to affect you in a way that that has to do with really who you are. You hear people say all the time, for instance, oh, I had to wear a lot of hats today, right? Well, those hats that you put on in order to serve a collective role, they're what Jungian people call your persona, right? It's not you, it's not the core you, but it's a role that you take on in order to serve a function in the world. And so you might find that there's some shuffling in the hats that you wear. And then, of course, by putting on a new hat that you haven't put on before, you learn you have to be creative in inhabiting that role. You learn, well, this is my particular way of wearing that hat. So that's the fifth house, is, you know, taking risks with your identity and taking creative risks and taking, you know, inhabiting that particular role in your own way. And then once you learn to do that, you can take that to higher places and go to the ninth house and expand that out. And like, let's talk to, you know, people in other countries about this, and or other, you know, ninth house being far away places and publishing and so forth, you see. Mm-hmm. So there's different combinations of houses that are activated both in your natal chart, and I have a whole chapter dedicated to that, delineating that. And each year, if you have houses 2, 6, and 10 activated, these are more like associated with career and work and stuff. So I call that the trigon of mastery. And if you have houses 3, 7, and 11 activated, that's what's happening for me this year. I'm an Aquarius ascendant, so Aries is 3 signs ahead of that, and then Leo is 7 signs ahead, and then Sagittarius is 11 signs. So 3, 7, and 11 are different kinds of relationships, right? 7th houses are one-on-one relationships. The 11th houses are group relationships, and then the 3rd house is like our community relationships. So, and, you know, it's interesting that here I am, you know, meeting a new friend way across, about as far away as we could be from one another and still be in the U.S., and, you know, talking about interesting subjects, and, you know, the 11th house often being associated with like-minded people and so forth, you know. So what didn't I cover? So then you have, if the 4th house, the 8th house, and the 12th house are being activated, I call this the trigon of dynasty, because the 4th house is kind of like what you're born with, you know, your family, but it's also what you leave behind. And so the 4th house can be about your foundations. The 8th house is what you share with other people whom you're intimate with, both in terms of personal relationships and business, right? Other people's money. And the 12th house is about kind of your, so it's like kind of like 3 different types of family. You're like birth family, your marriage and business family, and your spiritual family. The 12th house is like people that you share family feelings with through a spiritual communion. And so depending on which of these 4 trigons, I call them, that are being activated, you're going to experience this in a particular set of houses. And so, you know, it's basically like this. It's like, what's your bucket list with respect to those houses? Is there anything you haven't done yet? Is there anything you've done too much of and you want to stop doing? You know, is there, you know, what about those houses would you like to change? Well, set your intention to change that now, and when Mercury retrograde comes, he'll help you do it.
I love that.
Yeah. It's that beautiful. It's that simple.
Okay, so Gary, if people want to learn more about you, I know pick up Gary's book, and do you want to show the cover again for anyone who
Yeah, so it's Hermetica Triptycha. It's available from Revito Press.
Can we get on Amazon, or is it, where do we go?
Yeah, it's on Amazon. There's a sample chapter that people can read through my publisher, Revito Press, if they want to check out a sample of it. I've got one review so far on Amazon. There's more reviews coming. There's a couple videos on my website where I've been in other interviews talking about this. You know, my 11th house just got activated. But yeah, dreamastrologer.com is my website. There's a lot more information there about me, and my podcast is the Hermetic Astrology Podcast. And I'm on Facebook, so you know you can like me there and everything. I lecture all across the country quite frequently, and I'm going to be in next place I'm going to be is in Chicago in May. It's kind of like the Astrology Olympics, is the only metaphor I can use. We have this thing called UAC, United Astrology Conference, and it happens about every 4 to 6 years. It's always in a different city. That's why I say Astrology Olympics, right? But it's huge. It's like hundreds of astrologers from all over the world, and there's like at any given time when there's talks scheduled, you could choose between 15 different talks. It's like crazy.
We're going to be there. It'll be my first.
Are you going to be there? Awesome. We'll get to meet in person. Right on.
Yep. It'll be the Astrology Hub. I think our whole team's going to go. So anyone that
wants
to, and we want to have a party and invite all of you. So
right on. Yeah. Sounds great. Yeah. UAC's great for parties too, by the way.
That's what I heard. Okay. So you'll be traveling around. If they want to learn about where you're speaking next, they can get on your mailing list.
There's a page there that has my lecture tour. I'm going to be giving I do a thing called Sky Astrology Conference for people who want to get out and actually get under the stars. We're going to be doing one of those in Colorado later this year. This year, Mars is going to be as bright as Mars ever gets. So I'm not just a Mercury guy, just so you know. And so we're going to have a conference out there with a really bright Mars, for instance. But yeah, people can find out more about that on my site as well.
Fantastic. All right. And for all of you out there who have not yet registered for our 2018 Forecast Marathon that's happening next week, it's free. It's January 9th, 10th, and 11th from, oh my goodness, what time? 1 o'clock Pacific, 4 o'clock Eastern, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And if you cannot make the times, please still register, because we will have a limited time replay of the forecast. So we're going to have 13 astrologers giving us the entire lowdown on 2018 and the important dates, the key transits, things to look out for, the big major themes that we'll be working with. So make sure that you join us for that. Again, it's free, January 9th, 10th, and 11th. We're also going to be opening up our Inner Circle membership, so you get to learn more about that and what is involved in that membership. So I hope to see you all next week for that. Gary, is there anything that you wanted to leave us with that we didn't talk about?
If anybody's interested, I'm holding kind of a raffle. I also have like an Inner Circle thing where I have subscribers who get premium content that goes along with my podcast each month. And the person who posts the reader review that gets the most, that is voted the most helpful on Amazon is going to win a free 1-year subscription. So if you do get the book, and you are the kind of person that does reviews, post a review and you might win a free subscription.
Fantastic. And this is a new book, right? It just came out very recently.
Yes, ma'am. It came out, well, it was technically published in September, but that was when we started taking pre-orders. So yeah, it's been out for a couple months now.
Nice. All right. Yeah. Gary, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
been such a pleasure. Yes,
Yeah.
thank you. And thanks to all of you for tuning in. We will be here not next week. Actually, next week we will be doing the forecast marathon. So you'll be seeing a lot of me, enough of me, January 9th, 10th, and 11th with 13 different astrologers. And the link to join that is going to be in the chat and above the video. And then we'll be back on Astrology Hub TV, regular broadcast times the following week. I want to thank you all for tuning in and for making astrology a part of your life. We'll see you next time.